Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in our EU HTA regulation series. This one is titled Expert Strategies for Success. I'm Max Craig. I'm a Senior Vice President at SSI, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Chantal and Gils, Vice President of Evidence and Value here at SSI. So over the next hour, we'd like to get into some of the recent updates on the EU HTA regulation and how companies can begin to adjust their strategies and plans for 2025 and beyond. But before that, we'd like to do a quick recap of the first webinar and some key points of the new regulation. I'd also like to note that there is a chat function to ask questions, and we do have some time set aside at the end of the webinar to answer any questions you may have. For any questions we don't get to today, we'll be sending out a post-webinar follow-up, including a question and answer section. However, if you submit them anonymously, we won't be able to get back to you directly, so we encourage you to include your name in your question so we can follow up with you directly. As we mentioned, this is the second webinar in our EU HTA regulation series. A few months ago, Chantal was joined by our colleague Sigrid Klar to discuss the key components of health technology assessments and the foundational aspects of the new HTA regulation. For a quick refresher, health technology assessments are a systematic multidisciplinary process that evaluates the properties, effects, and impacts of health technologies while considering the social, economic, organizational, and ethical issues related to that technology. HTA's end goal are to provide evidence-based information to help make safe, clinically effective, and cost-effective decisions about health technologies. But today, Chantal and I would like to discuss the latest for HTAs in Europe and what the regulation means for drug developers. So to start, Chantal, there are two initial questions I'd like to ask you so that we're all on the same page on what the EU HTA regulation is and who it affects. So let's dive in. First, what exactly is the EU HTA regulation and when does it come into effect?
Yes, let me start with a small recap indeed of last webinar. So the EU HTA regulation is a new regulation for a more unified approach for assessment and the procedure for market access in Europe. And actually, it's really about two key activities who will be performed at the European EU-wide level. First is the Joint Clinical Assessment, or the JCA. And this is an assessment of the relative effectiveness and the relative safety. And this is ultimately mandatory for all medicines and certain medical devices that obtain regulatory approval via the EMA. Then the second key activity is the Joint Scientific Consultation, which is the JCSC. Always confused here about the letters. But this JSC is actually an equivalent to the regulatory scientific advice, but then from an HTA perspective. This all comes in effect into January 12th, 2025. So that's really soon. And this will be a phased implementation where oncology and ATMP, so the cell and gene therapy drugs, come first. And then in 2025, orphan designated drugs will follow. And by 2030, everything will be in scope. So that's the quick recap.
Yeah, and just a clarification, 2028 will be the orphan drug with all drugs to follow in 2030.
Yes.
And so, how is this regulation different from the historic HTA processes in Europe? We then had this interim process over the last year, kind of in between the regulation being announced and then January 12th when the regulation actually takes effect. So, kind of what's new, what's different, why does this matter?
Well, today, and still until end of the year, the HTA assessments are very scattered. They're done on a country level. So we have 27 EU member states, 27 different assessments. And with the regulation, at least part of this assessment, because you already elaborated on the fact that HTA has many components, like it's from effectiveness, safety, relative effectiveness and safety, but also economic aspect, social aspect, etc. But only really the clinical effectiveness, the relative effectiveness and safety are now part of this unified assessment at the EU level. And it runs fully in parallel with the regulatory approval process, so which is much earlier than is currently happening in most of the countries. And where today the assessments are typically initiated only after the regulatory approval, and then also more in a staggered way, focusing on the key markets first. Now this relative effectiveness and safety part comes in parallel and earlier. So it's just a clinical assessments, but then still it should be noted that the economic and societal parts actually are still handled at the EU member state level, even after 2025, and decisions about reimbursement will still take place at the individual level. So it's really a European relative effectiveness assessments. And, you know, although challenges are foreseen, of course, it is considered a huge step forward. And pharma companies actually have asked many years for this because they like to have a more harmonized approach, avoid duplication, and ultimately increase consistency and the quality of assessments. Ultimately, it's there to facilitate and speed up market access and patient access to novel treatments. So that's the ultimate higher level aim.
Yeah, absolutely. And really aim to kind of lower the disparate evidence burden that you may face, doing anywhere between a couple to, however many member states that you would want to go into right now, to really kind of make it easier from that clinical aspect, from, what evidence you need to generate.
Yeah,
But good to note also that for, access and reimbursement, it's still at kind of the member state level. So keep that in the back of your mind as you're building out
absolutely.
your plans, that you still need to have that kind of launch plan aspect and commercialization plan in mind for where you're actually going to go, get access for the drug.
Yes, absolutely. And still, I think member states could decide differently based on their individual perspective.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
yes, it's an important first step to have the assessment there.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. And it's been a couple months since our last webinar. A lot has been changing, like we talked about. We're still in kind of this interim period. The new regulation doesn't launch for still another 3 months, which seems very close and very far away at the same time. So what's changed over the summer? What are some of the recent updates that people should be aware of?
Well, what you see now is that the European Commission is quickly launching guidance documents. There has a lot been launched. There's also quite a few to come in Q4. We are in Q4 now, by the way, so we're following up closely. But they're coming out, and especially one guidance document around to help companies understand the requirements in terms of studies, analysis, and outcomes. Is very helpful. And also a deeper specification of the medicines in scope has been published. We can provide those links, I think, in the summary. But what is important there is that it's, for example, only new drugs and not label extensions at this point are part of the scope. And, so there you can really assess, is my drug in scope? And last week, actually, I spoke to someone from the EMA and the HTA bodies, and they have said that they got some applications already in, some notifications,
Nice.
and then but then they saw, okay, but you're actually not in scope.
Oh,
And also the
well.
other way around, there was a letter of intent from an EMA, MAA application, and then it was they thought, okay, but are they aware that they also
Yeah.
are subject to the JCA? Because, so it's important to check that. And then I think another interesting thing is that there's also the EMA themselves on their website have published guidance to applicants on how to declare in the EMA letter of intent whether the application falls under the scope of the HTA regulation. So that's how you can kind of notify. And at the same time, you are also requested to notify the European Commission as well. So how that works is explained there. And then last week, I think also we mentioned a draft version of the Joint Scientific Consultation Implementation Act came out, still for public consultation. I don't expect many changes though, but it's for I think it's closes in a couple of days, and then and they had a lot of details around how the procedure, the Joint Scientific Consultation procedure, is going to work in parallel or not with the EMA scientific advice. And I think what is important to mention here, and what I get many questions about, is joint in GSC stands for joint HTA bodies altogether. So,
Right.
so the joint GSC is really, JSC is really about HTA advice. And then you can do that in parallel or not with EMA
Hmm.
scientific advice. So the parallel
Yeah.
word stands for with regulatory or not, and the
Right.
joint stands for all bodies together. And since there has been quite some confusion, I'm explicitly stating this. It is
Perfect.
recommended to do it in combination with the
Hmm.
EMA, but not obligatory.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think kind of 3 months out, both for the regulating bodies as well as for drug developers, it's getting real. A lot more guidance, like you said, is coming out, and kind of the process, which was announced a while back, is starting to take shape a little bit more. And I think it is important, like you said, for people to understand what some of these words mean, what joint means when you're thinking about joint scientific consultation or joint clinical assessment. That's HTA. But yes, it runs in parallel with that, MA process. And that is
Yes.
also, very important. As you said, you have to be mindful when you're submitting your letter of intent to the EMA to understand whether or not your drug is in scope, um, coming up soon in 2025 for ATMPs in oncology, but also looking further out. As we know, drug development takes a while. So if you're, looking at a launch in, 2029, 2030, or 2030, you're looking at kind of further down in your development plan, and you're an orphan drug, you have to be aware of that as well. So, folks really need to be mindful of when my therapy actually becomes part of this regulation, so that you're making the regulating bodies aware as soon as possible, and making sure you're building that into your plans as early as you can, to make sure that you have all the evidence you need when you go into these discussions.
Yes,
Sure.
absolutely.
Awesome. Another question that we frequently hear from our clients, and we touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper, is how does this the whole HTA process, but how do the JSC and the JCA process align with regulatory timelines, and how can we kind of parallel path those? Where do they intertwine? Where do they kind of separate? What are some of the intricacies there?
Well, it starts first from a timeline perspective, right? So like we already kind of mentioned, it starts with the letter of intent, which is typically for a marketing authorization application submission. You do that around 6 to 7 months ahead of
Mhm.
your actual submission. And now what's changing, so that's actually now because we are close by, um, you in parallel send a notification to the HTA coordination group of the European Commission, and then basically the parallel, they will inform each other, and everyone is on the same page. This is a procedure that runs in parallel, and then. But then there's also a lot of differences. What happens then is that after the notification, the um, the work will start at the HCA side to kind of determine the scope for the JCA, because that scope, as we have said before, will be determined by the assessor and
Mhm.
not by the company themselves. And once determined, it will be communicated by means of the PICO scope. So it will be said your scope for your JCA is that we want to understand the relative effectiveness and safety of your drug in population ABC. Could be of course, it's always the label population, but then it could also be a more restricted population in
Mhm.
addition, or another population where it's anticipated that would be where the drug would be positioned and would be relevant. And then what comparators would need to be considered in this per population. And then what outcomes are considered relevant for these relative comparisons. After that communication, so the moment you have that communication in hand, you have a window of 100 days to prepare,
Mhm.
finalize your dossier, and including all the requested analysis, and make sure you get your dossier in. So that's a
Mhm.
100-day window. And then ultimately, there's also a firm deadline, which I think will be also challenging from a assessor perspective, but there's also a firm deadline that the full JCA process should then be finished and published 30 days after the final EC decision. And at
Mhm.
that stage, that's out there in public, and it will be the starting point for all these 27 member states for their assessment for reimbursements.
Yeah. So sounds like a lot happens in a little bit of time. Kind of thinking that 100 days out, when you get your pico scope from the assessors, that seems like a major challenge. Only knowing 100 days out, kind of what you're going to be assessed on. What are some other major challenges that you see, and some opportunities that come from those challenges?
Well, I mean, the challenge is really the timeline, right?
Hmm.
I think I think that's the major thing. We heard uncertainty, and then of course the timeline, and especially since you don't know the scope for sure upfront, and
Hmm.
especially and if the scope is very different from what was anticipated by the company, then that's difficult, at least to say.
Hmm.
And also when there is really limited data available, how can you then build your dossier? Um, so and I think if you then go back to how companies today are organized, is typically the EMA submission readiness is dictating the company timelines.
Hmm.
When you're ready to submit for your EMA because your phase 3 is out, that's how that's so then I anticipate that the HTA preparation should just make sure they are at pair with the AMA
Hmm.
timelines and the EMA team being ready. And today a much more sequential approach is being taken. When we are ready for HTA, we will go for HTA. So that's going to be very challenging, I think. And then around this picoscope, this is not likely limited to what's being captured in the pivotal clinical trials.
Right.
There is often looking at different populations, different comparators. I mean, there's only so much you can include in your
Hmm.
pivotal trial, and
Hmm.
possibly different outcomes if you don't anticipate them. So I think, yeah, there is a lot of work to do, and it's not really necessarily fully connected. But I see this honestly more as a great opportunity, um, because the the JCA needs and the scope that this will now be requested early is not really different from what HTA
Hmm.
bodies across the 27 member states, and including the UK, by the way, it's
Hmm.
across Europe,
Right.
are asking today in terms of evidence requirements to make a positive reimbursement decision.
Hmm.
So you need that. It's not different evidence, it's just different timing, but the evidence is necessary today. And today, what you see is that even after regulatory approval, it can take years to get reimbursement when the right evidence is lacking. So
Hmm.
if you start thinking about what do I need only after EMA approval or very close to, then you will really, as a company, actually be the
Hmm.
cause of delays, not necessarily from a payer perspective. So, and what does an early EMA approval bring then? So in that sense, I hope that this is creating, this regulation will create a push in companies to prioritize
Hmm.
value or HTA needs in an earlier stage of clinical development, and to really look at the added value of a treatment in the context of available treatment options, and then the
Hmm.
unmet need that is still there. And let that guide drug developments, as opposed to just focus on benefit risk and then later on value. So I think that's the right thing to do anyhow.
Right.
And so optimizing drug development with an earlier and more integrated evidence planning was always the right thing to do,
Right.
if you would ask me. But now I hope that with the HTA regulation, people who are with me here, and mostly that's HTA,
Hmm.
people with HTA backgrounds, and they have the opportunity to really prioritize this thinking earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think a couple key points that you hit there was, if you're early on in your drug development process, an integrated evidence plan, kind of, with, an internal assessment of what the PICOs may be based on, other marketed drugs or other folks that are in development, best way to go. We do have some companies that are midstream that are now going to be part of the regulation, and so they're playing a little bit of catch up. But again, it's kind of taking that step back, looking at your current evidence base, understanding, like you said, that your clinical trials might not give you everything that you need, and that's okay. But what else do you need to do, to make sure that you have that full evidence package, when you go for this parallel path? And so I think it's no matter what, it's kind of taking that breath and taking that step back and saying, okay, what do we have currently planned, executed, and what else do we think that we need to do? And let's plan that out to make sure that, we're not holding up the process from an evidence standpoint. So I think that's really important for folks to kind of ingrain, is just, making sure that you have that full evidence package ready to go.
Yes, and connected to your point is that it's not just a European show or hurdle in this sense, right? Of course, Europe is very HTA focused.
Hmm.
In the US, things are a bit different, or at least the word HTA is not widespread used
Hmm.
in assessments. But honestly, also in the US, what is the value of a drug in the context of the existing treatment options, and where is
Hmm.
it positioned?
Hmm.
That's thinking that also US payers and across the
Absolutely.
globe actually payers are
Absolutely.
looking at.
Yeah.
So thinking about the value and how am I going to ensure that I collect the evidence relative to the comparators that are today on the market
Right.
is anyways thinking that needs to be there, and much more intertwined with current
Yeah.
drug development.
E-
So I think it goes very broad in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Even if it's not a formally structured regulation, it's always beneficial to have, that value-based evidence package for, wherever you're launching across the globe.
Yes, so but of course we're now focusing on getting the
We
dossier
are.
ready.
We are. Absolutely.
uh,
Um,
um,
so another question that we get a lot, and kind of tied to the discussion we were just having, is how should we adjust clinical development plans to accommodate, both regulatory and HTA requirements, whether that's early on, whether we're midstream, whether we're about to start our pivotal, enrolling our pivotal trial, kind of what can we do to kind of right the ship, or at least, build that in really early on, should we be, entering clinic or in our phase 1 or somewhere like that?
yeah, so that's of course the major question. What do you really need to do? And
Hmm.
I do have a perspective on that, and I would like to make 3 points here. So first of
Hmm.
all, I think the earliest thinking around a very early pico or a very early value is actually when you are developing your target product profile. I mean, that's the earliest
Right.
point. And to think about a TPP that is not
Hmm.
fully focused on the mechanism or potential of the drug, but also includes uh, aspects of value to patients in the context of the existing
Hmm.
treatment landscape.
Hmm.
Because actually, what is the actual burden of disease in this context? I mean, what problem, I often ask, what problem are you actually solving? And
Yeah.
how does that problem currently affect the patient's quality of life? Um, and if there are many treatments available, then think about where would you position a drug in this
Hmm.
context? And is there even a place? And that's actually very early, first pico, but ultimately, wherever you are, like early, midstream, late, there's you can always think about, okay, what with the knowledge I have today, would the pico scope could that look like, given what we know about the European treatment landscape, for example?
Hmm.
If
Hmm.
you are in oncology, I always look at the ESMO guidelines and really think, okay, what are the current treatment guidelines? Where could your drug fit in? What does that mean from a potential populations and comparators perspective, and also look at and what any company does, look at the other potential comparators or competitors in
Hmm.
development, because if
Hmm.
they come way earlier than you or a little bit earlier than you may need to consider these too. It's
Right.
challenging, but that's the perspective of the payers, right? So keep on thinking about these picos, start very early. And then another tip is actually to really try to optimize your pivotal trials to fulfill these JCA requirements.
Hmm.
And may also seem very challenging, because what you often see is that trials, there's a lot of focus on FDA and EMA and
Clinical endpoints and regulatory needs. Yeah.
yeah, making sure and a lot of anxiety that whatever
Mhm.
we do may not jeopardize that, or
Right.
maybe and ideally even the quickest road to FDA approval or EMA approval. So um, mostly even FDA approval. So the thing is that so that seems like, can we add another perspective? And I think you anyhow need to do it. You need to think about it because sometimes there's really you can there's an equal choice A and B, and then if B is much more
Hmm.
favorable for HTA, you can choose B. But also sometimes there's low-hanging fruit, making sure that some outcomes are being collected,
Hmm.
making sure that you are not missing out on outcomes. They're usually rather easy to add. And then
Hmm.
also, if you know already early what you will not be able to capture, you can at least understand, okay, I will need to do indirect treatment comparisons versus ABC, but how can I now design my trial in an optimal way to make these comparisons valid because you know how
Right.
competitors have designed their drugs
Right.
and outcomes and outcome definitions or subpopulations to
Hmm.
facilitate that. So that's another way, optimize your pivotal trials. And
Yeah.
then the third
Our
one,
I just
yeah,
wanted to jump in. Our colleague Sigrid, who used to be on the HTA side, she, her mantra is clinical evidence is the gold standard. So whatever you can do to build it into your clinical trials, that's the gold
yeah,
standard when you're thinking about the HTA. Obviously, RWE and other types of post-clinical evidence generation are fantastic. But if you can build it into your clinical trial, that's just, that's going to be the best bet for
yeah.
everybody.
It will put you three steps ahead, right?
Right. Yeah,
Direct,
absolutely.
RCTs are the
Hmm.
golden standards. It's important. But my third point, though,
Yes. Sorry.
was do consider real
Yeah.
evidence early.
Absolutely.
Because also clinical trials have limitations and are unlikely to fulfill all HTA relevant questions. And as real patients and real world settings are very important to payer,
Right.
and a clear real world evidence strategy can really move the needle here. And the
Hmm.
earlier you do so, the more you can do. If you go very early, you can even do some prospective data collection in
Hmm.
an observational way. But
Yeah.
if you are very late, and last week I was at Topra and we had a conversation about that, and it was so interesting because I was talking to someone from Roche. So this person, of course, they are big companies, so they know what to do.
Hmm.
But interestingly, she said, but I said, start real world evidence a bit earlier. And then she said,
Hmm.
well, we often buy drugs. We often buy a drug rather late from a very small partner. They start finding
Right.
partners
Right.
in Europe,
Yeah.
and then we get the package. And then the package has nothing on HTA, nothing on real world evidence already being thought of earlier. And this will then really delay time to
Hmm.
market in Europe.
Right.
So
Yeah.
even they are very, they don't often have to choose, can make that decision to start early only when they
Hmm.
develop very early
Right.
their own
Right.
product. So it's interesting that also she was kind of calling out, yes, please, if you're a small company, think about
Hmm.
these things because you
Yes.
increase your value because we
Right.
then get more value if people are really ready for HTA as well
Hmm.
or have been thinking about it.
Hmm.
So, and early real evidence does not need to cost as much as a very much it's not necessarily a huge investment if you
Hmm.
start it early and wisely. So I think that's another key point I would like to make as a real world evidence as
Yeah.
expert.
Absolutely. And I know we talk a lot about kind of getting the drug across the finish line. We're thinking kind of 2 years out from your submission date or things like that. But for folks that might be looking for kind of that early stage drug development, spin off to another company, that value perspective is really important too now with this new regulation of how do you create the best type of program value. um, and value means different things to different people. It means something different to regulators, to payers, to investors, to clinicians and healthcare providers. And so it's kind of taking that holistic mindset of what value is and what value means to you, and how do you best prepare your program for demonstrating that value within this new HTA regulation. And so I think that's important that we think
Yeah,
about getting to the HTA body, getting your JCA submitted, getting your access and reimbursement, but value starts way earlier. And there's many different ways that you can build and communicate your value.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So something else that we get a lot is, how, if there are any, how can we effectively prepare for potential discrepancies between regulatory and HTA requirements? We just talked about value means different things to different people. So, kind of how do we walk that tightrope and perform that balancing act in this new parallel path where we have two different bodies looking for two different things on, different sides of the same path?
Yes, well, and yes, so this discrepancy, let's be really clear by saying that regulators and HTA bodies and payers, they clearly have different perspective and remits by purpose, right?
Hmm.
So regulators are there to focus on what works and is safe.
Right.
That's the main focus. And then when it comes to HTA, and then ultimately the judgment by payers and governments is
Hmm.
really looking at this effectiveness and safety in the context of their real world, the real world reimbursable patient population and treatments that are currently available and currently already reimbursed. So everyone's requirements will differ. They're not going to be converging 100% because or not even close. They will stay separate in a way, but they supplement each other.
Hmm.
And the EMA, the indication that's to be approved by the EMA is actually leading the way as a starting point because that's the label indication and that's the starting point for then. Okay, but what do we then need to reimburse and what do we need to know in order to make that answer or get that
Hmm.
answer? So so to that extent, there are discrepancies. And I think what is particularly challenging is that if the proposed indication is then not accepted by the EMA, and then the JCA preparations are all on that particular
Hmm.
indication, then companies are like, okay, late changes, how can we then meet the deadlines? It's going to be really challenging to change the analysis, to change
Right.
the way you craft the dossier. But I think that normally, even from an EMA perspective, there are scenarios, or you take a higher risk or a lower risk. So I
Hmm.
think we will more converge about early alignment on what's, an early
Hmm.
anticipation, and maybe let's take a risk, be more certify, and then make sure that JCA is aligned. And so typically it's already, I would say that the final indication should already be one of the scenarios from a
Hmm.
JCA perspective. So I think there's only very rarely that it's really like out of the box.
Right.
And then even what was interesting, I heard last week also, we got a question, or actually my colleague, we had a panel at Topra, my colleague from the HTA bodies, she got a question about what if there's really no data? What if you ask us something and we cannot do it?
Yes.
How and then it was nice to see that she said, well, we will take a little bit of a pragmatic approach, right? We
Hmm.
know sometimes it is not possible, or when there's a new treatment that has just come out and there's very little
Right.
data, what is really necessary is that to give the idea, or that you have done what could be done, and
Right.
and that's all, and that's in that sense at least the key things are addressed, that there is also a paragraph on every analysis asked. But if there is really no data, it's not that you can't submit, you just submit and you make the best, and then it will be assessed, and then it will be taken by the individual
Hmm.
body. So I think that the fact that the word pragmatic
Hmm.
was used, I think that gave me a lot of comfort that in the end, why are we doing this? To facilitate access, not to put an extra hurdle up. And I hope that
Yeah.
that's going to be lived.
Uh, Yeah, and when we think about the drug categories that are part of the regulation in 3 months, so we're thinking about ATMPs, which are a lot of times for rare diseases, high unmet need, ultra rare diseases. Like you said, probably not a lot of evidence or comparators out there. Or we think about oncology, where you could have one product targeting multiple tumor types, multiple indications.
Yeah.
What are some of the implications of this regulation for those scenarios where there's little to no evidence, new mechanism of delivery route of administration, or going into thinking about oncology in these one product for many indications. Kind of what are some of the things we need to think about there?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And actually, but also in that sense, if you look at today's world,
Mhm.
you get a good sense already, I would say, because you see even in a very rare space, you see that some companies come with no evidence, no contextualization, single arm trial, and then yeah, we have
Right.
nothing. While other companies are very proactive in thinking, okay, how can we build the best contextualization? Can we do
Hmm.
some match analysis? They are very proactive in discussing with the EMA
Hmm.
very early. How can we, let's discuss how we can build the evidence for this very rare indication and that we think is acceptable to allow access or the first regulatory approval and then later
Hmm.
access. So there is a lot of different strategies that companies are taking, and I think
Right.
that the strategies that work best now at the individual level will also work best at
Hmm.
the JCA. The real difference really is that it's kind of another year earlier. So
Right.
that's it. But still, the perspectives are not changing, I would say.
Right. And it kind of goes back to, what you were saying, kind of our mantra is it's, the earlier the better. Both from building an evidence package, from building the value of your program, but also getting feedback on your program. And so that's where the JSC really comes in, and um it can be a kind of co-meeting, for your early scientific advice and your JSC, where when you're in these scenarios where you're not really sure what the best route forward is because it's a high unmet need population or one therapy, multiple indications. That's where the joint scientific consultation, potentially, paired with the early scientific advice, really becomes important for you to get that initial guidance, of how you're setting up your program and where you need to go in order to be prepared for your JCA. So I think that's a step. I know it's optional, but it's probably something that a lot of folks in these scenarios should think about doing, because it's
Yeah.
it's that early feedback.
Absolute, absolute.
Yeah.
Um, let's continue. I really would like to make sure that we have enough time for
Yeah, absolutely.
questions. So I think we have one more question, right? Before we are
I think before we jump to the open Q&A, the kind of the last question that we get a lot is how can we optimize our resources, to manage, now two parallel paths. When before it was we only had to go down regulatory, maybe do the HTA if we really thought we needed to do that. But now we have this extra burden on our team. How do we optimize and manage that?
yeah, I mean, there's no need to say that that is a challenge, right? And that's
Hmm.
a real challenge, and and whatever I say is only partly going to take that away.
Yeah.
But I think keyword is collaboration. The There's still a lot of siloed approaches to
Hmm.
these kind of, regulatory and HTA, HOR. So I think, and what you see today is that typically the responsibility for HTA evidence requirements sits with HOR or
Hmm.
market access departments. And it's also because HTA is it's like effectiveness, but also economics and everything.
Hmm.
So, but the HTA regulation actually is not about that, right? It's about relative effectiveness and safety. It's isolating that clinical evidence part from all the rest.
Hmm.
So in that sense, you can even question, should it sit with market access, or is it more something that should really be in the intersection of clinical development connected with regulatory and then HOR? So I
Hmm.
really think that there is a wealth of knowledge in clinical development and also regulatory departments with respect to efficacy, safety, and sometimes also relative effectiveness or
Hmm.
relative efficacy at least. So the jump is smaller than you would think. And I think the best and most aligned dossiers comes from strong
Hmm.
collaboration with the different departments and
Hmm.
starting early with that collaboration.
Hmm.
But I mean, resource wise, it will be challenging because it, since they are fully parallel paths, you are maybe in the peak of your preparation for your JCA while getting your first questions in from the EMA. And, it will be madness in that sense.
Yeah.
So I think at least a way how I would tackle this is at least make sure that you do have an overall structure of governance in place, an overarching team that is overseeing or aware of anything that happens in both the MAA procedure and the JCA procedure to ensure this aligned and optimized development.
Right.
But then also, of course, have two very focused assigned resource teams for MAA and JCA. In the end, it's two dossiers, right? So two focuses, it's two dossiers. Let there's not any confusion about that. It's two parallel trajectories. So two dossiers. And if you work, I think, with external consultants, it would be to support this high workloads. I would say it's sufficient to be able to work with a single external group who also feeds in that aligned who have experience with both the MAA and the JCA that can help with the streamlining as well and fully understand these interdependencies in the content as well as the timelines. So that would be my advice to at least we can say that it's a lot of planning, I think.
Yeah,
Planning.
absolutely. And yeah, I think your point of it's two execution teams, but they need to be led almost kind of centrally, but with that common goal and with that aligned thinking to make sure that they're not going down completely different paths or doing completely different things, though they are two dossiers, two separate submissions. It has to be coordinated because there's a lot of efficiencies across the teams, but still thinking that they are two separate work streams that need to have two execution teams dedicated to them. So it does get kind of challenging. It's definitely hard to kind of manage that and keep that moving forward together but separate almost in a way. But that's kind of the reality of how it needs to be done.
And I realize, Maxwell, and I think that's going to be part of the next webinar, but we only talk about the dossier writing, but then there's a whole lot of evidence generation before, right? And it's about, an indirect treatment comparison. What kind of methods do we have for that? How can you build that with a broad set of scenarios and narrow down towards the end in an effective manner? I think there's a lot to say about that. I'm not going to go there now, but it starts with, if you are well positioned on your evidence, it's pulling it in an effective way in your dossier, right? So, but that's, I would say, let's try to.
Yep. All right. Chantal, I just want to thank you for the excellent insight. I know we want to make sure that we leave enough time for Q&A. I think we have a couple in the chat right now. But just to kind of recap a little bit, it's companies should start as early as possible. We understand that everyone's kind of starting at different times based on where you are in your development life cycle when the regulation comes online and when your products are beholden to that regulation. But kind of from that first instance of knowing that, okay, we're going to be part of this regulation, that's when you should start your planning to make sure that you have the evidence package that you need to make sure you have the value that you need to communicate to different stakeholders of your program, and just making sure that you're kind of perpetuating that throughout, the entire development life cycle. And kind of Chantal, you mentioned a little bit of a plug for single folks that can run both MAA and HTA submissions, in a collaborative way. So at SSI, we do have very strong regulatory experience in EMA submissions. We also have deep experience in health technology assessments. We have folks, from some of those agencies, on our team now, so they know the intricacies and the inner workings of how those kind of paths and submissions work. And so I think our team is uniquely positioned to help with this parallel path MAA JCA submission. And from the start of 2024, once kind of it became real and we were kind of a year out, We did have a variety of companies already come to us at various stages of development to really a lot of the questions that we got were just kind of, can you help us understand the new regulation? There's a lot of kind of interim guidance, final guidance out there. How do we make sense of it? And how do we understand how it applies to our program? And now we're starting to get into that, okay, this is real. We need to start either, requesting a JSC, preparing our kind of, our internal analysis of what our PICOs are, preparing for how do we write this JCA dossier? How do we kind of get our evidence package where it needs to be? And so we've kind of already seen the somewhat of the full life cycle. Obviously, there haven't been any submissions yet because it's starting next year, but we've seen that kind of full preparation life cycle already from very, very early on to we're starting our pivotal trial soon. How do we kind of fit this into this new regulation because it's coming online right in the middle of our program? So, we've kind of already seen that gamut. And so, I do want to open it up to a couple questions. I think we have a few. Chantal, I'll let you kind of, decide which ones you want to tackle first, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I see that. I mean, we've been saying put them in the chat, but actually there's of course a Q&A button in the
there you go. Yeah.
in the Zoom. Nice. So feel free to put in your questions if you have them. We have 15 minutes left for questions. I see a couple, so I can start addressing these. So the first I see is for the PICO, is there a different approach of evidence or questions for conditional approvals versus traditional approval applications? The answer actually is no. So that's actually challenging. We talked a little bit about it, but the PICO, like said, is really driven by the question from the payer, from the HTA body, what they think is relevant for decision making and what EU thinks it's relevant for decision making. They will not look at the availability of evidence. They will just look at, this is what I want to know from my patients. So, in that sense, I think what we will just see that if there is a conditional approval, that's likely the evidence will be thin, and maybe the assessment will be more like, okay, we have no solid evidence that A, B, C, D. And well, then ultimately, it's to be seen how that will then be handled on at the national levels, right? But you already see today that conditional approvals could lead to challenges at the reimbursement side from the reimbursement decision side. So the earlier the evidence comes in, the better it is. So let's see. But PICO request scope will not be different. On the assessment side, I'm not the assessor, so let's hope pragmatic means something.
Yes.
Or if not, then maybe conditional approvals become less interesting in the end. And I see another one on the, I think that's a quickie actually. How is the HTA regulation applied for orphan drugs? Is the application based on target indications or whether drug product received orphan drug designation? That's an easy one because it's really orphan designated drugs. So if you apply for that and you're coming after 2028, yes, you will be in scope.
Hey, Chantal, we had a follow-up question to the PICO for CMA and full MAA. Does this also apply to an MA under exceptional circumstances when the comprehensive data required for a full MAA may never be available?
Yes. So yes is so the PICO will still be the same, but I'm pretty sure that, I mean, even the EMA does not give away marketing authorization under exceptional circumstances for nothing, right? Usually there's a huge medical need that is being addressed, etc., etc. So still, the PICO is the PICO. The data that can be provided will be limited. And to also in that sense, which then will probably, I mean, and let's not forget the assessment will not even judge whether it's enough or not for reimbursement. They will just do a very technical assessment and will then
Right.
probably say we cannot say anything because this data was not there for.
Right.
But it's not a judgment. The judgment is up to the. It's like the EMA does judgments about approvals. It's the individual member states. So you will still be requested the full PICO, what is relevant. Also because these are the relevant policy questions that I also think the companies are invited to please focus on for the next years to come if you don't have it now. So they want to make no distinction there. Policy questions are the policy questions, but the way they will be look at the evidence provided will very likely be different and has already kind of been confirmed in conversations I had. So I think that there on that end, there is some flexibility.
And I think an important point there is the PICO is the PICO. That's kind of the, what the HTA body will assess your program on. But again, kind of thinking about, yes, you need to try to, you should try to meet those PICOs in full. That's kind of, what they're saying is, kind of best case, this is what, we want to assess your program on, and you should be prepared to meet these evidentiary needs. Obviously, in some of these, whether it's orphan drug or some of these rare diseases with high unmet need, that might not be possible. But what you're saying is that's not a kind of deal stopper. It's just, this is kind of the best case that they would like to assess the program on. Understanding, going back to that word pragmatic, taking a pragmatic approach to what is actually feasible based on the drug, on the indication, on many different factors. They're going to take that into account. But again, they're just kind of laying out kind of best case or total case scenario for what you should be looking at from a PICO perspective. But the other point that I also wanted to make too is kind of the member states are still allowed to ask for additional evidence for your program. They're just not allowed to ask for anything that's included in your JCA dossier. So like you said, the JCA dossier and kind of the HTA regulation is about that clinical effectiveness, making sure it's effective, it's safe, assessing it from that perspective. But when you get to, interacting with each of the member states, there may be specific things that they are going to want to see or look at. And so that's where kind of that end in mind commercialization strategy comes in, of saying, we're going to go to these 5 EU countries. France is looking for something different than Italy is looking for something different from Spain, just on kind of how their national health systems are set up. And so knowing that too early on, make sure that when you go through your EMA HTA process, and now you get to your access and reimbursement at the member states, you're prepared for those interactions as well, and having the evidence you need for those too.
Yes, absolutely. I want to make one point though. So what is communicated and what is the aim ultimately is that from a relative effectiveness and safety perspective, there should be no additional request from the individual member states, because that's part should be covered, because otherwise, the sky is the limit. So that's however, you're right. Also, when it comes to some countries are very cost effectiveness oriented, other ones less. So there is nuance there, and there will be additional stuff being required, additional evidence, either depending on the country, but from a relative effectiveness and safety perspective, it should be comprehensive and complete.
Yes.
So that's one aspect. Otherwise, we are double doing it. So that's the vision, at least.
And
let's see how it turns out in practice.
And that's the aim of the new regulation is not to have double work.
Yes. The another point to come back to the question in the chat is that with expedited pathways, like you aim to go for conditional based on a phase 2 single arm study, or you go for an exceptional circumstances expedited pathway, whatever you my recommendation is always, if you anticipate that you may want to go for approval already after your phase 2 because the unmet need is so high or whatsoever, if you have a scenario, not maybe a base case, but if there is a clinical or regulatory scenario that is including we go based on phase 2, I mean, that's an early scenario usually. Then make sure you start building your evidence on top of your phase two. Think
Right.
about those outcomes that you would then need in
Right.
your phase two. So just and like an external contextualization, etc., etc. So the you cannot just have, oh, now we have our phase two, we have nothing because it's the
Right.
phase two. No, because anticipation is everything, and you will
Hmm.
not be, it will appreciate it, much valued and appreciated if you are proactive about
Yeah.
the needs. So I think that's probably my last say on this. Oh yeah, we have a
Okay.
very small, I think it's
Yeah.
interesting, and the
Yeah.
last very small question, I can handle that, I think, in a minute. um, it's very concrete. Will the JSC template be the same as the EMA template for scientific
Hmm.
advice? So this is about scientific advice, or will we have to create two separate briefing documents? One briefing document for the parallel advice. So it's sufficient. There's one briefing document and there is one integrated procedure.
Hmm.
However, it's really on the same table, but everyone on the same table, which can be
Yep.
helpful. However, the template is different than the current EMA template. So if you go for the parallel, they will send you a kind of a template that
Hmm.
incorporates the ability to both HTA questions as well as EMA questions, because ultimately you direct your questions about scientific advice, ABCD, to the EMA, other questions to the
Hmm.
JCA, and that so it will still be two sets of questions embedded in one briefing package and one
Yep.
adapted template. So that's it. Only
Awesome.
5 minutes to
Yes.
do it all.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, Chantal, thank you for your time. I also want to thank everyone that logged in to the webinar today, or perhaps you're listening to recording. Um, Thank you again for your time. Chantal and I could talk about this all day, and we do talk about this all day as the leads for our evidence and value hub here at SSI, which the HTA preparation and process and execution falls under. Um, so again, I think just thinking back to some of the key takeaways, Chantal, is start as early as you can. We now know that this is happening. It's coming online in 3 months. There's, an interim process right now that some people are in, but in 3 months for oncology and ATMP therapies, you're in it. If you're launching in Europe, post that, you're going to be part of this regulation. So start thinking about it early and often. And kind of the other big takeaway is there's not it's not that there's not a lot changing there. Obviously there is a lot changing from a process perspective, but kind of from showing a value for your program or how you need to build kind of the relative effectiveness um, of your program, that's not changing a whole lot. It's just how that's going to be assessed is changing. And so there's a
And
lot of
when?
the same, and when a lot of the same steps that we still need to do in drug development are there. Really, this regulation is about taking a lot of that evidence burden off the drug developers from a relative effectiveness perspective, and not having to do 27 different types of relative effectiveness assessment.
The HTA, yeah.
It's really doing that one to kind of get you most of the way there, to have those detailed conversations with the member states that you're actually, that you're going to hopefully launch in their countries and get access and reimbursement. So again, it's a lot's changing from a process perspective, from an assessment standpoint, but we still need to do the same things that we're doing as drug developers and have been doing for years prior to this. So I think that's a little bit of comfort in kind of this new change. And yeah, I think it's start thinking, look towards the future and start saying, okay, really understanding when your indication or when your therapy will be part of the new regulation, and making sure that you are including that in your letter of intent to EMA, or making EMA and the HTA body aware as soon as possible that you will need to go for JCA, as well as in parallel path your MAA, and then getting that early feedback in parallel with scientific
Yeah,
advice through
feedback
the
is
JSC. Like,
important.
those are very important. So I think those are the couple key things for me.
And I think, thanks, Max. And I really think
Yeah.
if there's any question, feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, please do reach out, and we'll be
We're
sending a webinar follow-up
with
that will
also with
have.
any questions,
Yep.
because follow-up questions we think is all relevant, and we will happy
Hmm.
to address them in the next webinar that we are planning already.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Chantal, for your great insight.